Oh, it is recording. Somebody's chatted. Let me see what's on the chat real quick. Good audio from the dark side. All right, that's good. Thank you. All right. Well, somebody else is coming in Zoom. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Now, look, everyone's joining. Can everybody see the screen share? Okay. I'm going to make it in presentation mode here in a second. Or is that window blocking it right now because I have the participants? All right, I got a thumbs up. There we go. All right, let's make this. Yeah. All right.
Okay. I think most of you know me here. My name is Richard Trace, president of the POA. The Lake Committee got an excellent presentation on the lake. There was some confusion about Lake Holiday as a whole. This is strictly a presentation on the lake. It's money that we have spent in the past, and why and what we did around that. The money we're spending presently and the money we're going to be spending in the future. It's a review of all that and how all that takes place, because it ultimately affects all of us in our assessments down the road. So Jim is going to go ahead and present it. If we have any questions, we'll wait to the end, particularly those on Zoom, and open it up for discussions if you'd like. With that, Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Richard. I assume everyone can hear me on Zoom, and if not, scream or yell or raise your thumb down, okay, or whatever you guys do on Zoom. So first of all, thanks, Richard. Thanks to all the people on the Lake Committee. Thanks to the Board of Directors for supporting all the things that we've been doing for the last several years in the Lake Committee, and it's been a lot. A lot of people put a lot of time and a lot of work into what you're going to hear about tonight, and I just want to recognize a lot of people are involved in this activity. So, I mean, I don't need to tell any of you this, you already know this, but Lake Holiday, and I feel strongly about this, it's a rare jewel. There aren't very many lakes within a 2-hour drive of Washington, D.C. You can count them on maybe 2 or 3 fingers. And we discovered Lake Holiday back in the 90s. We were very lucky. We had no idea it was here. Very well kept secret. You know, and Lake Holiday isn't just a beautiful lake, it's a clean lake. It's in good shape, relatively speaking, and we want to keep it that way. You know, I've been to other lakes around here. I've been to Lake Anna. I mean, it's got a nuclear power plant on it, for crying out loud. Lake of the Woods, I've been there several times. No thank you. Lake Holiday is special. There's no doubt about it. And we've done a good job so far of keeping it that way. But there's some things that are threatening the lake that we need to know about and talk about and think about. And that's what we're going to be doing and talking about tonight. Now, it wasn't just people like me and Chris and others on the Lake Committee that did this work. We have a lake consultant, a professional company called Princeton Hydro out of Princeton, New Jersey. They're one of the premier lake engineering water quality companies in the United States. And so they've done a lot of this work with us and for us, and that we're using the results of their work to make decisions going forward. The good news is that our lake is in good shape, and it should stay that way for many, many years. Even if we do nothing, it'll stay in a good condition for many years, most likely. But there's a caution. There's a caution here. Our lake is definitely, we know this from the data that's been collected, our lake is gradually trending towards a condition called eutrophication. And I'll explain what eutrophication is in a few minutes. And we don't want that, okay? It's called lake aging is what eutrophication is. The bad news is there's no bad news. There's no bad news. We just want to take the opportunity, we have the time to do the right things, to plan ahead and make the right decisions over the next few years. We have years, we have not just months, we have years before we are in a situation where we're forced to do something, in any case, drastic. We don't have that right now. But we know what's going on, and we're trying to make some good decisions going forward. You can go to the next slide, please. So when Richard advertised this talk, yeah. We're trying to do the Zoom advanced slide here, and so give us 1 sec. Okay, we got it. This talk was advertised as the history of the lake. Well, I had to add this slide because I had nothing on the history of the lake, but I do now. And no, this isn't about how many movie stars came out of the community or famous politicians, and if there are, let me know because I have no idea who they are. This is a nutshell history since the lake was formed in 1970, 72, about the water side of the lake. What happened, what are the major events that affected the water, the lake itself? And I'm sure a lot of you know this stuff, but we're going to go through real quick. The lake was formed, constructed, and the dam was built in a couple years, 70 to 72. Okay. And in June 1972, in 6 days, Hurricane Agnes filled the entire lake in 6 days. It was expected to take 2 years to fill this lake. It filled in 6 days. That was in 72. Then we have this sort of this period, I call it the black hole period, a lack of information on lake water conditions. No one was monitoring, there was no data, there's really no information. We know we had random sewage spills coming out of the pump stations, the community sewage system. We know that. I was here during part of that. I experienced some of that. Very little information on why those things were happening. They were fixed on an ad hoc basis. We had very little information on bacteria counts in the lake at that time. So it was kind of like, that's the way it was. But fishing was good. So people were happy in general. We get into the mid-2000s, and as you know, Aqua purchased the Lake Holiday water and sewer system. And about that same time, the office started collecting bacteria data in the lake. And then in later years, closer to now, the Lake Committee now collects bacteria data on a weekly basis during the summer. And if there are any exceedances over the state criteria, we report that out, make sure people know that they shouldn't be swimming in the lake. But we haven't had any of those problems for a long time. I don't know, Judy, at least for a couple of years. 2 full seasons without any, 2 full seasons we've gone now without having any elevated bacteria events. And that's good news. And I think in part, it's probably because Aqua is doing a better job of managing the system. It's not perfect, but it's better than it used to be, okay? Now we get into the 2012 time period, a little closer to where we are now. As you know, the state of Virginia changed the code, the safety code on dam spillways. And we realized that, and the state told us that, hey, your spillway doesn't meet code. It will not handle the maximum flood. And so we had to rebuild the spillway, which we did, lowered the lake level by over 10 feet for at least a year. Maybe it was 18 months, I forget, 18 months. While that was going on, the construction, and the new spillway was completed in 2013. Partly because of the drop in the elevation of the water level, it affected the fishery. We know from state surveys of our fish that the bass population drastically went down during this period. It was in part due to the drawdown of the lake, but in part also due to loss of habitat. Also at the same time, and I don't know if some of you have been here a long time, through the 90s and the 2000s, we started to see aquatic vegetation starting to grow in the lake where it had never been before. I noticed that near our dock. And in the period around that time, after the lake was refilled and the spillway was completed, hydrilla spread, invasive hydrilla spread throughout the lake in high density and became a problem. And because of that, we added grass carp to take care of the hydrilla, and boy, did it work. work great. There is no hydrilla, and not only is there no hydrilla in the lake, there's no plants anywhere in the lake unless it's growing right on the shore, above the lake surface. If anything in the lake is being eaten, it's gone. There is no vegetation right now in Lake Holiday. That is a problem because it takes away the habitat that juvenile fish need to grow and repopulate the lake. Okay, so that's one issue. That's not the focus of our presentation, but it is an issue. Now, I've colored in yellow the big star. This is our wake-up call. This is where everything started to happen, and it's the focus of my talk. We had a wake-up call in October 2016. We had our first ever harmful algae bloom, HAB. That's actually the scientific name of a harmful algae bloom, is HAB. And we had to close the lake to direct contact recreation for several days. And right after that, within a few months, we hired Princeton Hydro, went through a competitive bid process, and they started working for us to determine what the hell, excuse me, my language, what is going on in our lake? What happened? We've never had this before. And over the last roughly 4 years now, we've been doing a number of studies. Most of that work's been done by Princeton Hydro to figure out what's driving the processes of this lake, scientifically, data-driven, modeling, etc. And that's what we're going to talk about. So go on to the next slide. All right, should be Lake Holiday at a glance, and some of you may have seen this slide before. It's been used a few times. So I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to just mention a couple important things here. Lake Holiday, it's got lake in its name, but it's not a lake, it's a reservoir. It's a man-made reservoir. Why is that important? Because a natural lake typically has a watershed feeding into it about ratio of 10:1 by area. Lake Holiday has a ratio of about 30:1, 3 times. So the watershed around us feeding Lake Holiday is 3 times bigger than a natural lake would typically have. What does that mean? It means that we have a lot of stuff running off this watershed and getting into Lake Holiday. The other interesting or important fact is that because of the shape of Lake Holiday, it's kind of a bathtub. It's got a real deep area in it. Materials like sediment and phosphorus that get into the lake through precipitation and runoff from the watershed tends to stay in the lake, doesn't get flushed out. Okay, that's important to know. It acts like a bathtub. And you can see the numbers on here, how much sediment and how much phosphorus roughly come into our lake each year from runoff, from the watershed. It's a lot. Another key point is, remember this, phosphorus sticks to sediment. It adheres to sediment. So wherever the sediment goes, phosphorus goes. If we've got a lot of sediment coming into the lake, we got a lot of phosphorus right there with it. And it's all settling down into the bottom of the lake. Next slide. All right, so we're gonna do a little course 101 in lake ecology for a second here. So here's some of the main causes of water quality and ecological impacts on a lake or a reservoir. We already talked about runoff. Runoff due to precipitation or driven by precipitation. Stream bank erosion is the process typically when you have a stream and all of a sudden you build a whole bunch of houses and buildings and driveways, and that stream gets a lot more runoff coming into it because it's running off all the hard surfaces. The stream can't handle it. It goes out of its banks and it erodes everything around it. That's also happening here. Invasive plants. Well, we already talked about invasive plants. You have invasive plants when you have non-native plants that have somehow got into your lake, and hydrilla has been a huge problem in Lake Holiday in the past. Fertilizer. Please don't use phosphorus fertilizer if you live anywhere near Lake Holiday. Don't use it. Please do not use phosphorus. And nutrient impacts, not just nutrients coming in from the watershed, but because Lake Holiday stratifies in the summer, because it stratifies due to the thermal process, sun, oxygen at the bottom in the deep parts can go to zero. It happens every summer. We have areas of the lake that are anoxic, zero dissolved oxygen. Fish don't like that, but in addition to that, in the absence of oxygen, phosphorus laying on the bottom tends to chemically interact and be released into the water column, adding to the level of phosphorus that you don't want in the lake. Next. Another way of talking about all this is a term that is used by government entities a lot. It's called non-point source pollution. Sort of a general term. It's the biggest threat to surface water in the United States and in the world. And it's the biggest threat to Lake Holiday. Non-point source pollution is the process of rain coming off the watershed and bringing pollutants with it. That picture there on that slide basically is our watershed. It has everything. It has farms, buildings, roads, mountains, cows, you name it. We have all that in our watershed. So it's very appropriate. And the key pollutants of concern, again, are sediments, solids, phosphorus, nitrogen. Go ahead, next. So how do you know if your lake is sick or maybe trending towards getting sick? And we have symptoms now, symptoms of water quality and ecological impacts. This is where the term eutrophication comes in, the process of a lake aging. And you know your lake is getting sick if you've had one or more blue-green algae blooms, which we had in October of 2016, spreading of invasive plants, such as the hydrilla, which is the reason we brought carp in, predominance of rough fish. Rough fish is like catfish or carp instead of bass. And our bass population took a huge dive when the lake was drawn down and we lost some of our habitat. So we've had the problem of rough fish in Lake Holiday, although it's getting better now because of our process of restocking over the last several years. And then sedimentation. Is sedimentation a problem in Lake Holiday? You can't tell from looking at the lake, the beautiful picture in the first slide. We don't have a sedimentation problem. Well, you'll find out in a few slides from now that we do. And next slide, please. Eutrophication. What is eutrophication? Eutrophication is the scientific term for the process of a lake aging. Now, a natural lake and a natural surrounding, it ages over centuries. It takes forever for that process to occur. But if you have a lake that you've built all around it, houses and buildings and roads and farms, et cetera, and you have all these sources of pollution that are being brought into the lake from rainfall, it advances, makes it faster, the process much faster of aging the lake. And the lake is aging when the nutrient levels go up, when algae levels go up, when aquatic vegetation goes out of control, and it literally starts to fill in physically with sediment. That's the process of a lake aging. And many of these things are going on in Lake Holiday. It's hard to tell that they are unless you have the data to show that it is, and we now have that data. And Lake Holiday is going in that direction. Next, please. All right, so we already talked about a couple of these things. What are the factors that control lake conditions? We talked about age. Lake Holiday, by the way, Richard, in 2 years, if you mark it from June of 1972, we will have our 50th annual, what do you call it, 50th birthday. Thank you. 2 years, 50. Lake Holiday turns 50. I think we ought to have a big party. You're in charge. So we know now from Princeton Hydro's work that in 48 years, where we are now, 35,000 tons of sediment and 30 tons of phosphorus have come into and deposited and settled into the lake, okay? And that's through the process of watershed runoff. We know that the lake thermally stratifies each summer, causing low DO along the bottom in some areas, leading to internal release of phosphorus, adding to the phosphorus issue, depending on the weather and depending on the lake conditions. We also know that because of the great job the grass carp did in getting rid of all the hydrilla, they got rid of everything else too. So good plants and bad plants are all gone. There's like no plants in Lake Holiday anywhere. And the lack of SAV, and SAV means submerged aquatic vegetation, has not only shifted our biological balance to dominance by floating algae, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's also taken away an important habitat that's vital for the fish population to survive and improve. Because there's nowhere for the young fish to hide, basically. It's one of the main reasons. And not only that, but submerged vegetation also tends to suck up the phosphorus, which is also a good thing and something we need in this lake. So now, I think we're at the next slide. So at age 48, and it may say 47 in your handout because I made a mistake on the age, sorry about that. Where are we? Where's Lake Holiday at age 48? Well, we already talked about in October of 2016, we had kind of a wake-up call. We had a little bit of a midlife crisis. We had high phosphorus levels, and we had a harmful algae bloom that closed the lake for several days. First time ever happened. This is a sign that the lake is starting to turn eutrophic, not necessarily what we want in this lake. The good news is, since then, since 2016, so 2017, 18, and 19, and so far in 2020, because we have some monitoring data that's been collected so far in May of this year, phosphorus levels have remained lower than they were in 2016. Probably mainly driven by the amount of precipitation that's coming into the lake. The higher the levels of rainfall, the more phosphorus tends to come in. Currently, as we said, there's no SAV in the lake. We need it to come back. We need to encourage it and find ways to help SAV recover in the lake. That's an ongoing struggle that we have right now. And then over time, and we don't really know how to pin this down, but say roughly over the next decade or so, so the next 10 years plus or minus, phosphorus levels in the lake continue to build up every year. It's always going up. It's never going down. It's always going up because it sits in the lake and it settles and it stays there. At some point, Lake Holiday will tend to move towards eutrophication. It's just eventually it's going to happen. Lake aging. Can't stop it. Well, we're going to try. That's what I'm getting to now. So next. So, how do we do this? What do we do? How do we stop this progression? It's exactly the same as this concept of, hey, I'm a middle-aged guy or old guy, go in and get my annual physical, and the doctor says, Jim, you're a little overweight, your blood pressure is a little high, your weight's a little up there, your cholesterol's a little high. I mean, you need to go on a diet. Sorry. And that's all there is to it. And so, and go on, next one there. So what kind of diet? Well, low fat, lots of veggies, like the drill and all. And this will make your heart healthy, your arteries healthy, and go, I think one more, yeah, there we go. And this concept is exactly the same concept as what we're talking about for Lake Holiday. It's exactly the same. Go to the next slide. A lake needs a balanced diet too. A lake needs a balanced diet to remain healthy. And it sounds funny, but it's true. Lakes need just the right amount of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. They need just the right amount of aquatic vegetation. What's wrong, Tom? Oh, you're just doing like that, okay. And, oh, he wants me to speed up, okay. Okay. So, just like the diet I have to be on, we have to put the lake on a diet, okay? We have to somehow control the amount of phosphorus and sediment that gets into the lake. It's a diet. The question is, how the heck do we do that? That's that's the question. Next. So let's talk about some options. Talked about, before, do nothing. Yeah, we have the option of doing nothing. We can do nothing, just be happy. And probably for years, we'll be fine. This is not something that's going to happen tomorrow or even next year. I think the lake is very slowly moving in the direction we don't want it to go in over years. But it's already started, and it's good far along in that process, okay? But it's time to do something now. So I'm not a big fan of doing nothing, okay? I guess you can tell. We need to manage the return of submerged aquatic vegetation. It's extremely important for many reasons. We got to get rid of the carp. We can't do anything in this area until we get rid of the grass carp. And I know we're trying, we're struggling with this. Eventually they'll die, but some people say it will take another 5 to 10 years for that to happen. Okay, so that's a challenge. And now we get to the tricky part. How do we do the diet concept for Lake Holiday? How do we control phosphorus and sediment getting into the lake? Well, you do that through a process called best management practices. Sorry about the engineering language. It's, we can't help ourselves. Best management practices, BMPs for short, so I'll use BMPs. Princeton Hydro, our lake consultant, has been doing a lot of modeling of the system, mathematical modeling. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. And they've come up with what they believe is the annual limit that we should keep the lake's amount of phosphorus getting into. And their limit is approximately 2,250 pounds per year to avoid the lake becoming eutrophic. By the way, that's a ton of phosphorus. It's a hell of a lot of phosphorus, excuse my language, but if we can't meet that limit, come on, shame on us. That's a lot of phosphorus. We got to keep it under that. Next slide. All right, so again, sorry for all the information, but it's an information-driven process we have here. So trying to explain how the diet works. I have this bar chart here, and you see 6 bars going across from left to right. And also on the left scale is the annual total phosphorus loadings in pounds. On the right scale is the lake-wide total phosphorus concentration in micrograms per liter. The horizontal line on the top going across is the recommended threshold of phosphorus concentration you should not go over if you want to not become eutrophic. And that's about 25 milligrams per liter. So that's kind of our upper limit on concentration for phosphorus in the lake. The next horizontal line down, which is kind of a dashed line, it's the recommended maximum annual amount of phosphorus in pounds that the lake can withstand or handle, 2,250 pounds per year. We don't want to go over that. And that third line below that is our plan. That's our plan. That's what we want to shoot for, keeping the amount to under that amount, which is 2,000 pounds per year, a ton of phosphorus. The first bar on the left is a typical annual year for Lake Holiday and how much phosphorus comes in, 1,400 to 1,800 pounds per year. And that dashed area, shaded area, is the range of internal loading that comes from the bottom, depending on weather in a given year. So there's a range there. So that's the typical. The second bar, the one next to the right of that, is what actually happened in 2018. So 2 years ago. It was a very wet, high precip year. And we almost exceeded our loading goal and well, we did exceed our loading goal, I'm sorry. We almost exceeded our concentration goal too, but we didn't. So that you can see that the concentrations and the loading are definitely precipitation driven, because in the next bar, number 3, 2019 was a dry year. And you can see the difference in loading, and you can see the difference in phosphorus concentrations of the lake, lower. Bar number 4, further to the right, is the recommended maximum loading on an annual basis to avoid eutrophication, 2,250 pounds. Bar number 5 is our plan. It's our limit. It's 2,000. That's what we want to shoot for when we're setting our diet. And then we'll get to 6 in a minute. We're going to come back to this slide. We're going to go to the next one now, and then we'll shoot back and forth. So the next one is entitled Controlling the Annual Phosphorus Loadings to Lake Holiday, the diet. We already talked about setting our goal of 2,000. We have yet to talk about our preferred BMP approach. We're going to be doing that. But it is defined as quote unquote in-lake catch basins in 2 coves, Isaacs Creek Cove, which is at the far western end of Lake Holiday, and Yider's Run Cove, which is past the marina. And I assume you all know where these 2 coves are in the lake. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. But again, the example we're using for if we installed what we would like to install as best management practices, these in-lake catch basins, they're designed to capture and retain sediment and phosphorus in those 2 coves such that we will be able, and we go back to the prior slide, which shows the 6th bar on the far right. The 6th bar on the far right in this graph is 2018 repeated, but if we had the BMPs installed, those in-lake catch basins in those 2 coves, we would be able to reduce or capture between the BMPs and our goal of also regrowing submerged aquatic vegetation. We would be able to capture and control about 600 pounds of that 2,260-ish, about 25% to 30%. If we can do that in that very high precip year, we would be able to meet our goal of staying below 2,000. So that's an example of what we're trying to achieve. I hope that's clear. In one of our worst case years of lots of rain and lots of phosphorus and sediment coming in, if we had the right types of structural BMPs in place, theoretically, it would stop and capture and retain enough material to prevent it from getting into the lake and causing further damage to the lake. That's the concept. Okay. We can go on. We can skip now to two slides ahead. The slide we're looking at right now, it should say on the top, 2019 BMP engineering analysis for Isaacs Creek and Yider's Run. PH is short for Princeton Hydro, our lake consultant. So at our request, we asked Princeton Hydro to take a detailed look at those 2 creeks, Isaacs Creek and Yider's Run. And they did exactly that, and they modeled mathematically those watersheds, those creeks. They did detailed analysis of the hydrology and hydraulics of those 2 creeks. The main thing we've learned about those 2 creeks, both of them, is because they're in steep terrain, and they're basically in bowls because of the mountains. The hydrograph is very rapid. The peak flows are very rapid. These are flashy streams. If a storm hits, it runs through those streams. The flow comes through very quickly, reaches a peak very quickly. It's not like very slow and drawn out and comes over in many days. No, it comes in a few minutes. You get a storm here, and the flow concentrates and comes into Lake Holiday very rapidly, and the velocities of the water coming from those 2 creeks is very high. It makes it extremely challenging to build anything there that'll work. And they did look at options. They looked at things like offline wetland or sedimentation basins. These are catch basins you would build up away from the lake, high up in the land, approaching the lake where the creek runs through. There's not enough land to do anything there. These have to be huge catch basins, acres in size. We don't have the land. There's not enough flat areas where these creeks are, where they're coming in. So we don't have that option. It would not work. Floodplain restoration is another concept, which is where you actually try to spread the flow out over a large floodplain. It's the same thing. It won't work because we don't have enough land that'll allow it to work. You have to spread the flow out and the sediment and allow it to settle. Won't work. But in-lake catch basins would work for us. The concept is you allow the creek and the storm flow to come into the lake, into the cove. As soon as it hits the water of the lake, it doesn't exactly stop, but it slows way down. As soon as that water gets into the lake itself, the velocities go way down, and the sediment that comes in starts to settle out immediately. And so the concept of an in-lake catch basin is you take a portion of each cove, Isaac's Cove, Yider's Run Cove, and you make a in-lake catch basin out of it to capture sediment. Try to keep as much of it concentrated in there as possible so it doesn't go out into the main lake. That's the concept. On to the next slide. Let's look at Isaac's Creek for a second. All right, so this is a 2011 aerial shot of Isaac's Creek Cove. And I said before that the terrain here is very steep. The amount of flat land above the lake is very small. And as water comes into this cove and sediment comes into this cove, it starts to settle out, but also a lot of it tends to keep going. And you can see the sediment plume in that aerial shot. That's typical for a storm coming into Isaac's Creek Cove area. Sediment comes in, it keeps going before it settles out and it gets into the main lake. A lot of it does stay in the cove, but some of it gets out. On to the next slide. Okay. One of the things we asked Princeton Hydro to do for us is do sediment surveys of these two cove areas. And so in 2019, they did detailed sediment surveys. And what these are is how much sediment has come in and settled in this lake since it was founded in 1972. We have that information now. This is it. In the inner cove area, we know that 5,700 cubic yards of sediment has been deposited in the immediate cove area. Basically, that's equivalent to a football field of sediment 3 feet deep. That's a lot. If you include the area that goes all the way out in this photo, in this graph, the total is almost 12,000 cubic yards of sediment has deposited in the larger area of Isaac's Cove over, should say, 48 years. And that's equivalent to about 2.25 football fields, 3 feet deep. It's a lot of sediment that's come in and settled into the lake over 48 years. Next slide. Another way of looking at this for this cove area, the inner cove, is depths in this cove have decreased by 3 to 4 feet throughout most of that cove. Some of the areas you can't get a boat in there. You used to be able to. You can sort of kayak through it, but in some areas even kayaks difficult to get through. Used to be much deeper. So that's kind of an important thing to realize about this area. And next graph. So I talked about the concept of a BMP that's called an in-lake catch basin. This is a concept drawing of what it would look like for Isaac's Cove. It's a little bit complicated, but a portion of it would be an area that's made deeper, and that's the cross-hatched area in the lower right part of the cove, where we would remove sediment and put an outer structural underwater berm to help capture and retain new sediment coming into that cove. The other areas, the three shaded areas to the upper and left, are areas where we would plant vegetation to create new habitat for the lake, not only to absorb phosphorus and sediment, but to create habitat for fish. So this is a dual objective to capture sediment and phosphorus before it gets out of the cove and to create new habitat. Okay, so that's our in-lake catch basin, which we call option B in this case. We'll move on now. Now we're going to go to Yider's Run. And I want to say before I get into Yider's Run, I want to say that Isaac's Cove is different than Yider's Run in a very significant way. Isaac's Cove is in a remote part of the lake. No one lives there. It is difficult to get to unless you're in a boat. There's no roads, there's no houses, there's no docks. It's a prime opportunity to create habitat for the lake, in that part of the lake, because it's so remote and would be very valuable for the lake. Yiders Run is a different story. It's surrounded by people. It's surrounded by docks and houses. It's a heavily populated area of the lake. So it limits what we can do there, and I'll mention that in a second. Like Isaacs, Yiders is very steep terrain. There's very little flat land area in that area, and when it rains and storms, Yiders just goes crazy. I mean, it peaks. In fact, it blew out one of our bridges a couple of years ago, and we had to rebuild the bridge on that. You know the road I mean. Anyway, thank you. Lakeview. That's the energy that these creeks have. It's huge. And that's why, again, we're looking at the concept of in-lake solution rather than something above the lake. It just wouldn't work. Next slide. Here's the sediment survey that Princeton Hydro did for us in the Yiders Cove area. Almost 10,000 cubic yards of sediment have deposited in the immediate inner cove area, which is the area that surrounds that long, thin island. You know what I'm talking about in Yiders. If you go to the outer Yiders area, which is shown in this picture, 21,000 cubic yards have deposited in this area over 48 years. It's a lot of sediment. On to the next slide. Another way of looking at this for Yiders, as we did with Isaacs, is what happens to the depths in Yiders Cove? They've decreased by 6 feet. In the last 48 years ago, Yiders was 6 feet deeper everywhere. So if you live there, you probably know what I'm talking about. Unless you moved in there last year, you wouldn't know the difference. All right, next. Yeah, or if you have a kayak, you wouldn't care anyway. This is the conceptual drawing of the solution, the BMP in-lake catch basin solution for Yiders. And it's basically creating a basin by removing sediment and putting an underwater berm to capture sediment coming in and phosphorus from Yiders Creek. It's similar to the concept for Isaacs that we showed you, but there's fewer opportunities to create large wetland habitat areas. You just don't have the area because it's so heavily populated. Doesn't mean we can't do something there. It might be surrounding that middle island, and that's always an option we will look at if we get that far. But that's generally what the concept would be. The capture efficiency of this basin is estimated at 45%. It would capture about half the amount of sediment coming in. The rest would escape past the berm. But half's better than nothing. Isaacs was a little less capture efficient because of the shape of the cove. And that's another thing we could get into and talk about all night, but probably don't want to. Okay, so where are we now? Well, we kind of showed you and we talked about that in summary. We've done a lot of work. Our lake consultant's done a tremendous amount of analysis for us. We've looked at lots of options. And what we're looking at, if we want to put the lake on a diet long-term, the solution would likely be to build these in-lake catch basins. But don't panic. I mean, don't panic because we're not doing this tomorrow. We're not doing this next month. We're not doing it next year. It may take us 5, 10 years or longer before we get to this point. But we're planning right now. We're planning. The pros of doing this type of a BMP would be, some of the advantages would be, just to create these basins in the first place, we would remove 9 years of phosphorus loading that's gotten into the lake. We would remove 21 years worth of sediment that's gotten into the lake. So that in itself is a pretty good advantage. In addition to that, it would capture a certain amount of new sediment and phosphorus getting in the lake from those two creeks each year. The sort of cons of this is cost. We don't know what the cost is yet. We know it would cost at least $500,000 or more. We don't really know because we don't have the engineering designs. We don't have the permit details. We don't know enough about what the regulators would require. So we're not there yet, but we know we're talking about something in the range of $500,000 or more. That's all we know right now. If we did this, we'd have to be careful to put up silt screens. We would try to limit how much material would be disturbed. We would want to do that. We might have to move some docks and yiders. We don't know that yet either, but those are all possibilities. So looking down the road, long-term, we would have to be aware of all these possibilities. And on to the next, almost the last slide here. Like I said, don't panic. We're a long ways from taking solid concrete steps to building anything right now. So here's a sort of a phased, if you will, phase 3 phase of a plan. We're in phase 1, 2020, near term. One of the things that we're doing right now, started the process, is work with an engineering company called GKY out of Fairfax, Virginia. We brought them on because they've done a lot of permit work in the state of Virginia, and they know the Army Corps of Engineers really well. They know the state of Virginia regulatory agencies really well. They work with them successfully on many projects. They're going to partner with us and help us meet with the regulatory agencies this year. No dates have been set yet, just starting. And we're going to find out from the regulatory agencies, what would it take to permit something like this? Do we have endangered species we need to worry about? Do we have wetlands that we need to make sure we don't disturb? Are there any eagle's nests anywhere near these spots? I don't know, I don't think so, but if there are, that would stop everything right there. It would be a difficult process to build anything near a eagle's nest, for example. But we're going to meet with the regulatory agencies sometime this year and find out what their requirements would be, because that will drive a lot of this process and tell us whether we can even do this or not. Another thing we're working on now is, and I'm sure you've heard some of these things, is figuring out how to get rid of the carp. And we're busy on that. We have a long ways to go. We have a lot of things that are going on, such as bow fishing, such as possible gill netting, and other ideas. It's not easy, but we're trying. And in the process of finally getting rid of the carp is we're working on concepts of repopulating the lake's submerged aquatic vegetation. That's extremely important for the future habitat of the lake. So those are things we're working on right now. Sometime in the next year, depending on what comes back from the permit analysis, and we would discuss this with the lake committee people, we would discuss it with the board, is decide whether we want to go forward with a final design of a in-lake catch basin BMP approach. And until then, until we do that, we really don't know how much it's going to cost. We have no idea at this point. We're a long ways from that. Phase 3 is possibly 10 years from now. We don't know for sure. Is if we decide we're going to actually build these things. That's phase 3. So that's the plan we've been working on. A lot, as I said before, a lot of work has gone into this. We're pretty sure we're on the right path, but we've got a long ways to go. And we want to, as well as I'm sure all of you do, we want to do the things that we need to protect this rare jewel that we have here called Lake Holiday. And I think we're done.
All right.
That's the rare jewel I'm talking about right there. And Richard, questions? Okay. Questions? Yes. We're all retired, though. We have nothing else to do. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. The question we just got from the audience is, if you pull sediment out of the lake from those coves, where does it go? Very good question. Well, part of the permitting process I just talked about is we're also looking at getting a permit to create a disposal area, which would be essentially berms that would be built on land. And the location we're looking at is, what do you call it? The current spoil disposal, or where you pick up mulch, where people can go up with their trucks and pick up free mulch on the top of the hill on the south side of the lake, off of Slay Drive or whatever the name of that road is there. That's the land area that potentially where we would be allowed or permitted to build a diked disposal area where the material you're talking about, the sediment from the lake, would be placed there. And then it would have to dewater over months and months, if not years, because it'd be full of water. Is that? Yes, it does. So the idea of the disposal area is you filter anything coming out of it. So you have filters. So any water that gets out of there would go through a series of filters. And then eventually, as it dewaters, because it's also evaporating into the air, you will restore it back to grass. Basically plant grass on the top of it. And remember, it's diked. It has a dike around it. So you're not going to allow it to go over the dike. It's going to always, the dikes will always be higher. Yes, sir.
They were pretty likely a major flush of those reservoirs to lose the sediments and also flush through the river banks. Is that something with my spillway?
No, it won't work. The problem is, good question, but the problem, it's not a problem. We could say it's an advantage. The question, I'm sorry, I'm repeating the questions from the audience. The question is, can you flush the lake out by allowing a lot of flow to go through the lake? Which actually already happens in a big storm. But as I'd said earlier in the talk, the shape of Lake Holiday is it's a bathtub, and especially the area down at the end where the dam is, it's 90 feet deep there. And by the time any material gets anywhere near the dam, it's already settled out and sitting on the bottom. It will never make it to the spillway. Maybe a small fraction will, but the shape of the lake, it's long and thin, and the sediment will literally settle out before it gets to the dam because it's very deep. That's why you can't flush it out. And I don't think the people downstream of us would be very happy about that either. Yes, sir. No. Good question. The question is, how much of the sediment and phosphorus getting to Lake Holiday actually comes from Lake Holiday land that we own here? We know, because it's been calculated, it's only a few percent. So 95+% of the sediment and phosphorus getting into Lake Holiday is beyond our land. It's beyond what we control. We have an 8,500 acre watershed that is composed primarily of low activity farmland. A lot of it's hay fields, some of it has cattle. We don't believe there's any high intense agricultural activity like growing corn. We haven't found that yet. We've tried. We're working with the Lord Fairfax Soil and Water Conservation District to try to help us identify any parcels of land in the watershed that could be targeted for improving how they're managed. So far, we haven't made much progress in that area. But but it's an excellent question because that's also part of what we're doing. We're planning to continue to meet with the conservation agencies, even take tours of the watershed and try to identify on our own, if necessary, if there's anything that can be done. But it's going to be an extremely difficult process to try to go that route because it's land we don't control, most of it. I wish you were at the Lord Fairfax meeting with us. They were extremely pessimistic about being able to help us do anything. And this is the agency that you have to go to get help. Doesn't mean we're going to not continue to try. We know that there are certain farms where the cattle just, they graze in Isaacs Creek. We know it. But will it be possible to have those farmers build fences? I can't tell you. I don't know. It's an excellent question.
It might be more cost effective if we could identify.
Yeah, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. We should, but each farm in itself is going to be a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the problem, which means to have any impact at all on a total load, you'd have to work with hundreds of farms. I mean, it's like, we're volunteers. I mean, what are we going to do? That's a full-time job for 10 people. Oh, sure. I don't know if it's hundreds either, but it's not one, it's not two, it's like a lot. It's a lot of farms. Oh, chat questions. Okay.
Ilsa said, what about the sources of phosphate in the upstream farmlands, which I think we talked about. And Leslie, what about some of the smaller coves that have significant runoff?
Yeah, the question is, are there other coves besides Isaacs and Yiders that are important? Sure. There's lots of small coves. I live in one of them. Parts of that are filling in too. But in terms of the impact to the lake, they're very small compared to those two coves. And the reason is because if you add Isaacs and Yiders together, they account for about 90+% of the watershed material getting into the lake. Maybe I have to go check it. It's probably close to 95%. So if you're going to put your focus somewhere, put it in those two spots. That's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Yes, sir. Yeah, I would start, maybe, but I would start with what we take out and put up in the upland disposal area, because you can, oh, I'm sorry. Okay. The question was, can we make money by selling the stuff that we take out of the lake? Maybe, I'm not really sure. It's going to be muck. It's going to be very soft, fine grained sediment laden with phosphorus. Is there a company that can take that and make fertilizer out of it? Maybe. We haven't looked at that. Among other things, but yeah, it's sediment and fertilizer together. You'd have to process it to get the fertilizer out of it. Yeah, it's very low concentration. Exactly. Thank you. I don't know. Not really sure. Good question. I had about every 20 years. The question was, how often would we have to clean out these in-lake catch basins? The estimate by our engineers is about every 20 years. And I won't even be here, so. Have fun. I mean, no, and all just aside, yes, these BMPs would have to be maintained. And we're talking a periodic maintenance about every 20 years. That's what they're telling us. Okay. Yes, sir.
That brings the water from the low depths higher to mix up the water and not have this dead water below. Is that something that would also suck up sediment and allow it? And how much water from the lake actually goes through the spillway and off the property?
Yeah, we actually know exactly what that number is, but I don't have it in my head or with me tonight. But I can, if you want, I can send it to you. Oh, okay. The question was how much of the water that gets into the lake runs off through the spillway? There is a percentage, and I can't remember what it is. It's probably somewhere around 10 to 20%. But it's surface water. Remember, it's water that's at the surface. Now, the other part of his question was if you put aerating systems in, so where you take the bottom water and shoot it up and mix it with the surface water and vice versa, would that be something beneficial to the lake? We've had that looked at by our consultant. The lake's too deep. It's too deep. It wouldn't work. There'd be too much energy requirement. So it was looked at. It might work in some spots, but if you look at the lake overall, it wouldn't, because the majority of our lake is too deep. Yeah. But it's a great question. I mean, these are some of the questions that other people have asked over the last 3 years. Why don't you aerate? And it was looked at. Anything else? That's it, I think.
Email us at the lake committee and we'll.
Okay, this will end our meeting, and on behalf of the board, I'd like to thank the Lake Committee and Jim for their outstanding work they've been doing. And the future of our lake is in their hands. And some of the Lake Committee is here. And this ends it's Tom, Demery, and you guys all got masks on. I can't see who we are.
Steve's over there.
Steve, I don't know if you know some of those. Okay. Anyway, this wraps up our meeting. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Nice job.
I have great.
Oh,
Okay. I have a question.
Nancy, we can hear you.
Okay. So I heard that there was a lot of stuff at the bottom of the lake, cars and refrigerators and stuff like that. Are there any plans to remove that? Because I would think that the rust from those items could possibly be could be a part of
I heard that rumor,
Machinery.
but I also was told that that's not a true rumor, that it's false.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, and I also have another question. Is there a way to humanely remove the carp from the lake rather than killing them, like relocate them to another area?
Mainly remove the carp from the lake. I think it's.
Yeah, possibly that would be a way of either electroshocking them. Electroshocking.
I was thinking of trapping them. Couldn't you trap them and
You could also try to gill net them, but that would pretty much kill them. So if you wanted to humanely put them somewhere else, you'd probably try to have to do electroshocking, which is a tool that the state uses a lot. The problem with electroshocking is that it shocks all fish. not just carpet.
Right, and we don't, yeah, I was just thinking of some way to humanely, because it seems a shame that we put them in Lake Holiday, they did their job, but they did more than their job, and now we're killing them.
You know, it's a huge puzzle we have. We're trying. We don't really have the answer. But that's a good thought.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining the Zoom meeting as well. So I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. And I guess we'll have the recording we can put somewhere. Yeah. Okay. It'll save it here to my screen. So let's.
What are we trying to do?
You recorded the meeting.
Oh, I have no idea.
Yeah, I did hit.
There might be people out there who want to see who we're on.
It recorded. So let's see.
So we had about 30